We like to believe that war is a human invention. We tell ourselves that the atrocities, the cold-blooded calculations, and the machines of death belong solely to us, to our species. We draw a sharp line between the civilized world of technology and the pure world of nature. But in the darkest rooms of the 20th century, that line was systematically erased. Imagine a soldier that never asks why. A soldier that requires no salary, feels no political allegiance, and can slip past the most advanced radar systems on Earth without leaving a trace. For decades, the world's most powerful militaries didn't just look to steel and silicon to win their wars. They looked into the eyes of the creatures we share this planet with. They looked at the loyalty of a dog, the echolocation of a dolphin, and the nesting instincts of a bat. And they saw something else. They saw a delivery system, a trigger, a weapon. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented history of Project 217 and its predecessors. From the sun-scorched deserts of New Mexico to the murky depths of the Vietnam coast, the narrative of living weapons is a journey into human desperation and the terrifying heights of scientific arrogance. Today, we open the files that were never meant to see the light of day. We are looking at the projects where nature was drafted into a war it never understood. This is the story of how we tried to turn our friends into our most lethal assassins. The year is 1942. The United States is reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese military is dug into deep volcanic caves and reinforced bunkers across the Pacific. Conventional bombing is proving difficult. The U.S. military needed a way to strike at the heart of Japan, its cities, which at the time were largely constructed of wood and paper. Enter Dr. Lytle Adams. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a physicist. He was a dentist from Pennsylvania. After a trip to Carlsbad Caverns, Adams became obsessed with the millions of Mexican free-tailed bats living there. He realized that these creatures were nature's most efficient cargo transporters. They could carry more than their own weight. They flew at night, and they had a natural instinct to find small, dark crevices to hide in. Adams wrote a letter to the White House. To his surprise, the idea was passed to the president. Franklin D. Roosevelt, desperate for an edge, gave the green light. The project was codenamed Project X-Ray. The mechanics were as bizarre as they were cruel. The military designed a tiny, finger-sized tube of fire, a 17-milligram napalm bomb. Using a surgical string and a dab of glue, they attached these bombs to the bats. The plan was to freeze the bats into a state of hibernation, load them into a bomb-shaped canister, and drop them over Japanese industrial centers. As the canister fell, it would open its wings, and the bats would warm up, wake up, and fly out. They would instinctively seek out the attics of the wooden houses below. Then, the timers would go off. Thousands of simultaneous fires would erupt, turning entire cities into unquenchable infernos. But there is a fundamental law in weaponizing nature. Instinct follows no command. During a test in 1943, several armed bats escaped. They didn't fly toward a simulated enemy. They flew to the nearest dark, cool spot. That spot was the underside of a fuel tank on the U.S. Army base. Within minutes, the very base designed to create this weapon was being burned to the ground by its own soldiers. The project was eventually scrapped, but not before the government spent millions on a bat bomb that proved nature cannot be caged in a blueprint. While the Americans were experimenting in the air, the Soviet Union was facing an existential threat on the ground. Hitler's panzers were tearing through the Russian steppes. The Red Army was losing tanks faster than they could build them. In their desperation, they turned to the anti-tank dog program. This was perhaps the most heart-wrenching betrayal of trust in the history of warfare. The concept was based on Pavlov's theories of classical conditioning. The Soviets would keep these dogs in cages and starve them for days. They would then hide meat under the hulls of tanks. Over time, the dogs learned a simple, deadly lesson. Under a tank is where the food is. When the time came for battle, the dogs were fitted with a canvas harness carrying 12 kilograms of high explosives. A 6-inch wooden lever acted as the detonator. When the dog crawled under a German tank to find the food, the lever would hit the metal chassis and the dog would be vaporized. But the Soviets had underestimated the chaos of the front lines. The dogs, terrified by the thunder of artillery and the smell of gunpowder, often refused to run toward the German lines. Worse, the dogs had been trained on Soviet tanks, which used diesel engines. German tanks used gasoline. To the dogs' sensitive noses, the food wasn't under the enemy tanks. It was back in the Russian trenches, under the Soviet tanks they had trained with. The result was a massacre. Dogs would turn around and run back to their trainers, seeking safety. Panicked Soviet soldiers were forced to shoot their own pets before they reached the trenches. The project was a tactical disaster and a moral stain on the Red Army. It proved that you could condition a dog to find food, but you couldn't condition it to ignore the sheer, blinding terror of a world at war. As the world moved into the Cold War, the focus shifted to the sea. The oceans were the new frontier of nuclear secrets, and the U.S. Navy realized that no sonar on Earth was as sophisticated as the echolocation of a dolphin. This is where Project 217 truly begins, the Navy Marine Mammal Program. Officially, dolphins were used for mine detection, but in the late 60s, a darker sub-program emerged, the Swimmer Nullification Program. The rumors are chilling. The Navy wasn't just training these animals to find objects, they were training them to find people. Specifically, enemy divers attempting to sabotage American ships. According to former trainers, the dolphins were fitted with a head-mounted device equipped with a pressurized carbon dioxide needle. The dolphin was trained to ram an intruder. Upon impact, the needle would penetrate the diver's skin and inject a massive volume of gas. The effect was instantaneous. The gas would expand inside the diver's body cavity, causing their internal organs to rupture. The dolphin, nature's most playful creature, had been turned into a biological torpedo. But there was a side effect. Dolphins are highly emotional, self-aware beings. Trainers reported that after neutralizing a target, the dolphins would often sink into deep depressions. They would stop eating. They would stop communicating. Some would simply stop breathing, an act of dolphin suicide. They were smart enough to do the job, but they were too smart to live with the consequences. The declassified files on Project 217 tell of a weapon that was too effective for its own psychological well-being. While the Navy looked to the sea, the CIA was looking at the domestic house cat. In the mid-60s, the agency spent 5 years and $20 million on a project codenamed Acoustic Kitty. They surgically implanted a microphone into a cat's ear canal, a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a thin wire antenna woven into its fur. They turned a living, breathing animal into a walking bug. On the day of the first field test, they released the cat near a Soviet compound. Instead of spying, the cat wandered into the street. In 5 seconds, 5 years of research and $20 million were flattened on the pavement by a yellow taxicab. The project was canceled immediately. To understand why these projects kept happening, we have to look at the philosophy of men like B.F. Skinner. They saw these animals as organic machines, reliable, expendable, and devoid of guilt. But nature is not a machine. A machine doesn't get scared. A machine doesn't get depressed. A machine doesn't decide that a taxi is more interesting than a Soviet secret. Every time we tried to turn an animal into a killer, we ran into the same wall: life. These animals were chosen for their intelligence, but it was that very intelligence that made them fail as weapons. Today, we look back at these projects and find them both tragic and comic. But there is a darker question. If we were willing to do this to the creatures we call man's best friend, what does that say about us? Project 217 wasn't just a failure of technology, it was a failure of the human spirit. The next time you see a dolphin jumping in the wake of a ship, or a dog waiting faithfully for its owner. Remember that for a brief, dark moment in history, we tried to turn that loyalty into a trigger. We tried to make nature a murderer. And perhaps the greatest victory for the natural world is that it simply refused to listen. History is written by the victors, but the truth is kept in the archives. I'm the archivist. Thanks for watching.